Breaking news right now, President Trump is wrapping up a meeting with El Salvador President Bukele at the White House. The Central American leader has quickly become a close ally of President Trump's after taking in hundreds of alleged gang members from the U.S. and putting them in a notorious mega prison. One of the people detained at Seacoast Prison is Kilmar Obrega Garcia, a Maryland father who was mistakenly deported by the Trump administration. The Supreme Court recently ordered the government to, quote, facilitate Obrega Garcia's return, but stopped short of requiring the government to bring him back to the U.S. Here's El Salvador's president indicating he's not planning to send him back either.
How can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it. It's like, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
Let's go now to CNN's Jeff Zeleny, who's at the White House. Jeff, they took questions for a little bit there. We learned a lot, including that big headline there that the El Salvadoran president does not intend on sending him back. But what more came out of the Oval Office today?
Well, Jessica, that meeting in the Oval Office showed that neither president, the U.S. president or the El Salvador president, showing any interest in trying to return the Maryland father who was wrongly deported. And, you know, as we've been following this for the last several weeks, the Trump administration admitted to an administrative error, and that led him to be wrongfully deported. Well, there was zero sign that either a leader or the U.S. government believes he should be returned. And now the Secretary of State and other White House officials are saying it's a matter of a foreign policy, and the Supreme Court cannot weigh in on this at all. But it was something else that the U.S. president said about the infamous prison in El Salvador. He said for the first time that homegrown criminals, that means American citizens, should also be sent there. Let's watch.
I'd like to go a step further. I mean, I said it to Pam. I don't know what the laws are. We always have to obey the laws, but we also have homegrown criminals that push people into subways, that hit elderly ladies on the back of the head with a baseball bat when they're not looking, that are absolute monsters. I'd like to include them in the group of people to get them out of the country.
So pretty extraordinary words there. The U.S. president saying that he would like to use homegrown criminals as well. We are now seeing pictures right here of President Bukele departing. Let's listen.
Yeah, thank you.
So departing after his lunch with the president and members of his delegation have been meeting for a couple hours or so. But one of the biggest headlines, of course, is how central to the Trump administration's immigration plans the prison in El Salvador has become. And clearly, Trump has an ally in President Bukele. The smiles all around certainly made clear of that, Jessica.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Jeff Zeleny at the White House. Thank you so much for that reporting. Boris?
Let's dig into this case with former U.S. Attorney Harry Litman. Harry, thanks so much for being with us. First, I want to get your interpretation of the Supreme Court's decision, because the administration and the judge in this case are interpreting it in diametrically opposed ways. So what exactly did the Supreme Court decide? How does it line up with what we heard from President Trump and his officials today?
The Supreme Court decided that the administration is obligated to correct its own constitutional error to facilitate, I'll get back to that in a moment, Obrega Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador. I emphasize that, Boris, because they mangled it in their submission to suggest the Supreme Court just said, return him to the United States. That's wrong. Their job is, in fact, necessarily to go as far as they can into El Salvador to release him. Now, the facilitate, effectuate dynamic obviously is a recognition that if push comes to shove, if we needed to declare war to go into El Salvador, that there would be some limit based on Article 2 powers. You couldn't push the administration around, but not simple moves to repair their own constitutional violations. And this seems like today, as you've just described it, really a travesty, because Bukele makes it seem as if he has no power. That's preposterous, to use his own words. Clearly, this is done by a contract to them. All we have to do is, I think, lift our finger and say, return Abrego Garcia, please. And I think it's implausible that anything happened other than a choreographed discussion in the Oval Office where he could take that stance to aid his ally, Donald Trump, to try to stonewall the Supreme Court and ignore their own constitutional transgression.
So, Harry, you don't buy the argument that administration officials are putting forward, like Stephen Miller, for example, when he says that a court cannot determine the foreign policy of the United States?
Look, it's all in the details, of course, Boris. What he's trying to reference is cases where you can't ultimately say, go to war, tell us where the troops are. This is, you have a contract and you must, there's no argument about the facilitate part. You must facilitate his release from custody in El Salvador to remedy your own constitutional violation. Obviously, that involves some communication with El Salvador, some request, which would be very easy, of course, in our contractual relationship. So to the extent he is saying that the mere mention of another country means you must be hands off, yes, that's wrong and contradicted by the Supreme Court's express holding last week and much other law.
What about his argument that Abrego Garcia was not mistakenly deported? He says, quote, when you have a withholding order, to be clear, that is not pause your deportation. What do you make of that explanation?
It is monstrous. That was what the order said is, you made whatever you do with this guy, don't send him to El Salvador where he is going to be subject to gang violence. That's a lawful order. And the attempt by the president to just say, well, I say otherwise. You can't say otherwise. That's the whole point, unless a court determines it and Abrego Garcia has a chance to contest it. And the only thing they've even pointed to is a stray remark by a confidential informant that really was discredited. So it's not simply false, but a real contradiction of the rights of due process before that determination, which could cost Abrego Garcia his life, is made. It is not to Donald Trump to now say ex post facto, he's a terrorist after all, don't worry about it.
Well, what about this indication from President Trump that he would consider sending U.S. citizens described as homegrown criminals to El Salvador? Can he legally do that?
Of course not. What he's saying is we'll have a constitution-free zone. Yes, there are terrible criminals here, but that doesn't mean you can torture them, for example. That's an Eighth Amendment violation. That doesn't mean you can violate all the rights. And that's exactly what he's suggesting. We'll do a constitution-free zone where we send them to our buddies to torture them, and nobody can contest it in the United States. It's pernicious. This is really, even in this case, an abomination of a day with both those suggestions, Boris. I know you can hear it from my tone, but it is way, way beyond the pale and just contempt for the Constitution and rule of law.
Harry Litman, appreciate you joining us.